They thought the path was clear. The breakthrough seemed perfect. Every step forward felt like victory. But the deeper they advanced, the more fragile their hold became. In the end, what looked like success turned into chaos. In the spring of 1940, Western Europe stood under the shadow of a new kind of war. Germany had already demonstrated how speed, coordination, and surprise could overwhelm traditional defenses. Belgium, officially neutral until the invasion began, became a critical corridor between France and the Netherlands. Its terrain, roads, and river lines were not designed for prolonged modern warfare, yet they would soon carry the weight of entire armies. The Belgian army, supported by British and French forces, expected the main German effort to follow predictable routes. Defensive planning relied on delaying actions along rivers and fortified positions. The assumption was that time could be bought, that Allied reserves could be deployed, that control would be maintained long enough to stabilize the front. On paper, the plan appeared sound. When German forces crossed into Belgium in May, their advance was rapid but uneven. Some units moved faster than supply lines could follow. Others became entangled in traffic jams of men, vehicles, and artillery. In several sectors, resistance slowed the attackers. In one specific corridor, however, a sudden breakthrough occurred. This breach was not part of a carefully balanced operation. It was an opportunity seized under pressure. Forward units advanced beyond their original objectives. Communication with higher command became strained. Maps lagged behind reality. Reports were incomplete. Yet the momentum felt undeniable. Commanders on the ground believed they had achieved something decisive. The breakthrough cut through Belgian positions that were undermanned and poorly supported. Local defenses collapsed quickly. Roads opened. Bridges were taken intact. Columns moved forward almost continuously, day and night. The success seemed to confirm the doctrine of speed. Delay was considered dangerous. Pausing was seen as weakness. But this success came with risks that were not fully acknowledged. Flanks were thin. Coordination with neighboring units was fragile. Supply elements struggled to keep pace. Radio communications suffered from interference and overload. The faster the advance continued, the less clear the situation became. Behind the advancing troops, gaps formed. Belgian and Allied forces were not destroyed. They were displaced. Disoriented, but still present. Units that were bypassed began to regroup. Roads that had carried the advance now carried confusion. What appeared to be a clean breakthrough was, in reality, an exposed thrust. The decision was made to continue forward. To exploit the opening fully. To turn speed into victory. No one yet understood that the breakthrough itself was the beginning of the disaster. As the advance pushed deeper into Belgian territory, the consequences of speed became harder to manage. Forward units moved beyond reliable support. Orders arrived late or contradicted earlier instructions. Field commanders relied increasingly on intuition rather than coordination. The terrain offered little cover. Open fields, narrow roads, and small villages forced columns into predictable routes. Movement slowed. Vehicles clustered together. Artillery lagged behind. Fuel shortages began to appear. Still, the push continued. Belgian and Allied forces began to react. Units that had been bypassed now understood the situation more clearly than the attackers. They knew the roads. They knew the bridges. They identified where the advance was thin and where it depended on a single route. Small groups reorganized quickly. Defensive pockets emerged behind the breakthrough. The sense of control at the front started to erode. Reports of resistance filtered back, but they were often dismissed. The assumption remained that enemy forces were in retreat, that opposition was scattered, that the window of opportunity was still open. Then the first supply convoys failed to arrive. Fuel trucks were delayed. Ammunition deliveries were interrupted. Medical evacuation became difficult. The distance between the spearhead and the rear grew wider with every hour. The breakthrough had created a long, fragile corridor rather than a secure front. Attempts to restore coordination came too late. Communication lines were overloaded. Radios failed. Messengers were delayed or lost. Orders to halt or consolidate were unclear. Some units stopped. Others pushed forward blindly. The cohesion that had made the initial advance possible began to fracture. Meanwhile, Belgian forces, supported by elements of British and French units, launched localized counterattacks. They did not aim to retake large territories. They aimed to cut roads, to isolate columns, to trap units that had gone too far, too fast. The breakthrough narrowed. What had been an opening became a funnel. Vehicles abandoned due to lack of fuel clogged the roads. Artillery was left behind. Infantry units dug in wherever they could, often without clear knowledge of neighboring positions. The sense of momentum vanished, replaced by uncertainty. By the time higher command recognized the scale of the problem, the situation was already unstable. The breakthrough had advanced faster than control could follow. And control was now slipping away. The turning point came abruptly. Counterattacks intensified along the narrow corridor of the advance. Bridges that had once enabled speed were destroyed or blocked. Roads were cut under fire. Units found themselves separated from one another, unable to maneuver or withdraw in an organized way. Attempts to regroup failed. Without fuel, vehicles became immobile targets. Without artillery support, infantry positions were vulnerable. Without reliable communication, coordination collapsed entirely. Orders could not reach the units that needed them most. Encirclement followed. What had been a forward thrust turned into a series of isolated pockets. Some units fought to break out. Others held their positions, waiting for relief that never arrived. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded accumulated in makeshift shelters. Belgian and Allied forces pressed cautiously but steadily. They exploited knowledge of the terrain. They avoided unnecessary losses. Their goal was not rapid movement, but containment. Losses mounted, not only in casualties, but in material. Tanks were abandoned. Trucks were destroyed. Artillery pieces were left in fields and villages, unusable. Entire units ceased to function as organized formations. The psychological impact was severe. Soldiers who had advanced confidently days earlier now faced confusion and isolation. Rumors spread faster than information. Some believed they were surrounded by overwhelming forces. Others expected a sudden rescue that never came. Surrender became inevitable for many. Small groups laid down their weapons. Others attempted escape under cover of darkness. A few succeeded. Most did not. The breakthrough, once celebrated, had trapped its own participants. By the time the fighting subsided, the corridor was silent. What remained were destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and scattered positions that told no clear story of how success had turned into failure. The disaster was not marked by a single decisive battle. It unfolded through loss of control. And it ended with disappearance. The advance finally ground to a halt, not because the troops were defeated in battle, but because the forces had simply outrun their own capacity to maintain cohesion. Vehicles that had once carried men and supplies now sat abandoned on the narrow roads, their engines cold, tires caked with mud, slowly sinking into the fields along the route. Ammunition and provisions, once organized and tracked, had been scattered or left behind, and the soldiers who remained were increasingly cut off from any reliable contact with their command. The once clear corridor that had promised swift movement became a tangled path of confusion and immobility, a trap carved by their own momentum. The men themselves were no longer units or formations. They had been reduced to groups and individuals, moving cautiously or standing silently beside wrecked trucks and artillery, uncertain of where the next enemy would appear. Some tried to regroup, attempting to reconnect with nearby comrades, but the distance between them and the rear positions was now too great, and communication had failed entirely. Radios, once buzzing with orders and updates, sat lifeless in muddy fields. Messengers who had attempted to carry word forward or backward often never arrived. In this silence, the breakthrough ceased to exist as an organized operation. It existed only as scattered traces across the Belgian countryside. Encirclement followed gradually but relentlessly. The advancing troops, once confident in their rapid success, now faced a network of opposition pockets that had organized in the wake of their advance. Roads were blocked or destroyed. Bridges they had relied upon were now impassable, either deliberately demolished or simply congested with abandoned vehicles. Isolated groups attempted to maneuver through the chaos, but with little coordination or hope of reinforcement. Slowly, the forward thrust transformed into a series of static positions, desperate attempts to hold what had already been lost. Casualties continued to mount, not just among the wounded or the dead, but among the equipment, the supplies, and the structure of the units themselves. Tanks, artillery, and trucks were left scattered in the fields, their presence a silent testament to overconfidence and miscalculation. Soldiers, exhausted, hungry, and anxious, moved with caution, aware that retreat was as dangerous as advancing. Small surrenders occurred here and there, individuals or groups laying down arms quietly, sometimes unnoticed by the enemy, sometimes under pressure. Yet even surrender offered no real resolution, as the remnants of the units continued to dissolve into the landscape, absorbed by the terrain and the fog of war. By the time the fighting subsided, the corridor was empty. There were no markers of victory, no preserved positions, and no clear traces of what had been intended. The men who had advanced so boldly faded first into the fields and villages they had crossed, and then into the reports that scarcely recorded their movements. The breakthrough itself, once hailed as swift and decisive, vanished into the larger tide of the campaign, leaving behind only abandoned equipment, wrecked roads, and a lingering sense of absence. In the end, the event disappeared entirely from memory, unmarked by monuments or stories, leaving only silence in its place. What remained was a testament to speed without control, to success transformed into failure, into the quiet emptiness that follows a disaster forgotten by history. Thank you for watching. New historical stories are published regularly.